Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Let's get in now to, so that's universities, right? We're talking semi-adults, I should say, fully adults, semi-functioning adults. As a student body, we're talking about professionals and administrators and all those, and it's looking tough there. Now let's shift the perspective of reopening schools down into high school, middle school, elementary, and kindergarten. Now, this is where we're really talking about that predicament state, because I want to start up front. I understand that these schools over time, the US economy has often relied on schools to provide social services that are not being provided through other means. We're talking about meals, counseling, support. There's all sorts of critical services that are IAP programs, right? Therapy services. These are all being provided by schools. And when schools aren't open, these services are either difficult or impossible to provide. But what happened is there's also some soft benefits. I mean, no one's going to say that in a perfect world, we wouldn't want necessarily kids to be, there's socialization benefits. There's time dealing with peers. And what happened is kind of the American Academy of Pediatrics kind of stepped into it in late June, because they came out with a guidance that really, it was timing wise. I'm sure they were developing this guidance as a bureaucratic institution does. It was probably being developed in May and early June, right? Going through approvals, and the pandemic looked like it was in a lull then. And they came out very strongly in favor of having kids go back to school. And they called it a catastrophe if they weren't in school. They said, here's this litany of problems. Social inequality will get worse. Abuse will get worse. All these things will get worse. And then that report came out right as the cases began surging. I mean, we were already in wave 1.5 from Memorial Day on, but it wasn't as apparent unless you were closely looking at it, until late June. And this report came out it probably didn't get that much attention when it came out, but a week after it came out, the president issued a threat using this report as justification. He said, any school that doesn't open is going to have their funds stripped from the federal government. Well, first of all, whenever you brief a principal, and I've done this in the military, you got to explain to them how the world works and how it doesn't work. There are certain things that can and can't be done by any principal officer in the United States government. I don't think anyone's like that doing that in the White House. The president does not have the ability to strip funds from school. And indeed, the federal government does not supply the majority of funds to schools. Something like 90 to 95% of local school budgets come from local, city, state funding sources, a lot of it through property taxes. So first of all, the fund spigot that if he could have a handle on is fairly small. Doesn't mean it wouldn't hurt. There's a lot of programs that are like, that give other sort of funding to school. But, and I also think that he couldn't just unilaterally remove that funding either. So he stepped into it. He took the AAP report and said, see, the best experts are saying we need to open. And this then caused what I call the French pivot. And a French pivot is when you're going in one direction and you pivot into the opposite direction and begin heading that way. And the AAP began executing a French pivot on July 8th. The president of the AAP got on NPR to do an interview. This was about 2 days after Trump issued his threats and said, well, let's not be hasty here, because they were asked directly, well, what about Florida? You have record-breaking cases. He goes, well, in Florida, if you have surging cases, you obviously need to be careful. We're not trying to suggest that you should open a school in the middle of a pandemic. And then probably a couple days ago, July 10th, the AAP completed that French pivot and came out with a clarification that emphasized physical safety is paramount, and that local COVID-19 community concerns would have to. So this really was a reversal of saying, it probably what happened is the original guidance was written under the assumption that pandemic's over, cases are declining, we're good. Let's reemphasize all the good benefits we get from being in school. But what happened is obviously wave 1.5 happened as predicted, or at least as predicted by me. And the cases surged, and they realized that this guidance in the context of surging cases looked like they were saying, go back and put your children in harm's way. And now I don't have a good model of what it looks like to open a daycare or a high school or a simulation or something like that. But what I do have is a very large study that just came out of South Korea that talks about the risks of infections of kids. Now, this is in the links, you can find it, but what they found was that it was a very large study. This is a preprint study. So again, this is still going through peer review, but this was a study that included contact tracing of 65,000 people in South Korea during the parts of the outbreak. And because they were doing contact tracing, they have a lot of good data on what the pass-through rate, the infectivity rate is for different age groups. So if you trace a person and you follow that person through their contact tracing and you start looking inside the household, you can start to see transmission rates. And because they were able to break it up by age demographic, they have a lot of good data. And what they found was that, as we suspected, young children have passed the virus on less than adults, but it's not at zero. It's probably like 18%. So it's much less than the adults, but that's only children 0 through 10. When you start getting into young adults aged 10 through 17, 10 through 18, they're passing on the virus just at the same rate as if they were adults. So when we talk about elementary and public schools, we might be able to distinguish a little bit of the threat just from a sheer passing on. But keep in mind, past studies have shown that even though this lower infectivity rate by a percentage, younger children in an environment of school are going to have higher contact rates. That may wash out this difference entirely. And I think it's important to understand, both with the university model and with the elementary and public schools discussion we're having, how these infections and testing and quarantines need to happen to get the best effect. So this is actually coming from Harvard research. This, again, the link's in the bottom. And what it shows is the causal chain of 3 infections. And to break it down, it's got the SEIR, susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. This is the model we've been using since January, SEIR or SIR. And what it does is each of these horizontal lines shows an infection pathway. And what it starts is the primary patient is infected at E, and over time they have a symptom onset at I. This is when they become symptomatic, if they become symptomatic. They get tested and isolated at the second I, and then this is the testing and tracing delay time. This time is crucial because this is the time you realize by the time we understand that they're positive, they have already infected the next person in the causal chain, and that person is going through the incubation and may have just got an onset of symptoms. At the time we tested the first one, this person is beginning to become symptomatic, but we can find out in a contact tracing, we can identify them, we can test them, we can get them to self-isolate, and then when they're self-isolated, what that does is that breaks the cycle. This third chain here shows that they could have exposed here, but if you can cut it off, the sooner you can get these contact tracing, the less second, third, fourth order folks you can have get infected by this. And this is really critical. This is why in that university model, you would have those outbreaks, and they found that the best testing models were more frequency. It's the time delay of how frequently you get tested to ensure that you're not having an outbreak. And from this data, Harvard has put together some community guidelines, and this is also pulling from what the CDC has, and it's starting to look at what are the different data and information we can take from a community to understand in terms of school safety. So in Harvard, they have several levels: red, orange, yellow, green. And this may look familiar to folks. A lot of communities are going this. So I wanted to walk through this because if you're a public school teacher, you probably need to know what this is and where the data comes from. But it's a risk level somewhat similar to the terrorism alert level. It's green is low risk, red is high risk. The case incident is the daily new cases per 100,000 people. So if you're at less than 1 per 100,000 new people, you're going to be in the green. And if you're up at over 25 cases per 100,000 people, that's a red. And what it does is it talks about the intensity of the control effort necessary in the community. So red is stay-at-home orders are necessary. Orange is strategic choices must be made. Green is you're on track for containment. But what's important about this Harvard resource I'm providing is it also shows here, how do you get from red to green, right? And there's a lot of data in here. The whole report's in the bottom, but they break it down, and if you're at maintenance and green level, this is what you should have in terms of your tracing capabilities, and later I'll go into testing. Suppression is if you're trying to reduce it to 0. If you want to reduce your outbreak to 0, you use the suppression column. And if you're trying to do mitigation, if you're just trying to reduce it a little bit, you want to use this level over here. But notice the number of traces. For all three, you need about 30 tracers per 100,000 people, or 1 per 4,000 in sparsely populated areas. On the yellow ones, it's still 30 traces per 100,000. But if you have an activation, if you have a surge, you either need 30 traces per 100,000 or 5 traces for every new confirmed daily case. So this would say if you had a town of 100,000 and you have 25 new daily cases per 100,000, which is that red level, that would say this you need 125 tracers because it's surging in that area. This also lays out the trace time, the percent of time. How fast do you need that trace time from when we identify who is infected to we've traced all their contacts they had? Remember, in that model I showed, or with the horizontal, that's that time delay that allows you to self-isolate and get people out of there. If you think about a school, if you find out a teacher's been infected, how long does it take to test every staff member, every fellow teacher, every student of those fellow teachers, to be able to go in there and begin getting them isolated out of the population so they're not infecting everyone else? And it says here the rules of thumb are within 24 hours, you need to have traced 90% of their contacts or greater. That's a very high requirement. And from a testing standpoint, it also points out this is where our positive test ratio numbers come from. If you're suppression or mitigation, this is where we get those 3% and 10%. If you're just trying to reduce it, you need to be less than 10%. Well, right now in the US, we're about 8% on average. But if you're trying to get to zero, which is what you probably need to do to get schools back open, is you need to have a suppression strategy, it should be less than 3%. You know, when we say about schools, that's going to be a local choice. Am I going to open my school in a local community? And for that, you need to understand the contact tracers and the testing percentage in your area. And we have a resource for that. I've shared this before, and it's the Test and Trace website. Again, the link's in the bottom for any educators or administrators that want to look at this. Go ahead, check out the link in the bottom. But if you're actually looking for more detailed, if you scroll down here, this is pretty useful. They have every state in the country, and you can simply sort. Remember that chart where it said under 10% or under 3% if you're going to zero? Well, right here, percent of tests that are positive over a 7-day moving average. We sort on that. These states here are telling you where you've got good suppression. Remember, under 3% is suppression. That means you're heading to zero. So you've got a list of states that are getting close to that. And it also lists the number of contact tracers per 100,000. This is a little iffier, right? You can have good testing, but if you don't have enough contact tracers and you have a large increase or a surge, you're not going to be able to keep up with it. So Connecticut looks pretty good, 24 contact tracers per 100,000, under 1% testing. That's pretty good. But look on the flip side. So let's test this now, right? Arizona, 24% positive. Idaho, 19% positive. Nevada, 18.5% positive. And look at their contact tracers per 100,000. They're not even in the ballpark. They need 30. They have 5, 14, 13, 3, 7. This is why these states are surging, and this is why you shouldn't open schools, because they don't have the capacity to do the testing and tracing to the levels that are necessary. And this is the risk that we talk about, because with all of this going on in the community, again, from that study in South Korea, we know that both children and young adults can pass on the infection. We know that. It's just at differing rates. For children, it's much less than adults, but for those 10 to 18, it's going to be about the same as adults. And yeah, Ed Cook says, how many tests do we need daily to test all these teachers and students in the public elementary school system? I mean, that's great question. So Ed, fantastic point. I actually polled from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics the estimates of how many teachers and staff are employed. Let's pull that up here. So it is, this data comes from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's from 2017, so a little out of date. It breaks it down into teachers, instructors, in elementary and secondary. These are people with direct interaction with the kids. So you're thinking testing here, you might want to have daily or every 3 days. This is 5.5 million people right here in this group, and you can see how it's broken down. But it also goes, schools don't run themselves just on teachers. There's staff and administrators and janitors and all cafeteria folks, bus drivers. There's about another 2 million there, and these may be able to get away with 3 tests a week, maybe once a week. But think about this. If we have 7.3 million instructors and staff in elementary and secondary schools, that's 3 million tests a day if you want to test every 3 days. And the current high nationwide is 850,000 tests a day, and that was 2 days ago. So if you want to test successfully have this testing strategy and reopen public schools, you've got to just about quadruple our current testing rate and have them all go to staff and instructors in elementary public schools. And that's not even counting the students. There's probably about 50 to 60 million students in the country, and I don't know how frequently you want to test them, even once a week. It would swamp our testing capacity. So, I mean, this leads to the next topic, which is, to me, there's only one safe way to reopen schools. In systems thinking, we talk about a null space for solutions. When you have you think about a space where all your solutions lie, a null space is an area where no solutions can be found. And this happens in complex problems. You have certain things that, when I was advising the military and we were deploying in Iraq and Afghanistan with so many brigades, and we said, we only want them for so long over there and they got to be home for so long, and there's a fixed number of brigades we have, we went back to the generals and said, this can't work. There is no math. There is no combination of techniques and tricks that will make these numbers work. And I think the null space for school reopening is when you have a pandemic outbreak, you cannot safely reopen the schools. And what that leads to the conclusion, and this is why I'm not getting into desk spacing and things like that, the path to safely reopening schools cannot be found in the schools themselves. It can only be found in reducing the community spread within which the schools occupy. That means the methods that are going to be most effective for assuring safe reopening of schools is to reduce the spread rate in the community within which the schools occupy. That's the only way I can see to safely reopen schools and universities. And it gets right back down to that pandemic response. What is the community doing about masks, social distancing, keeping things closed that need to stay closed, testing, contact tracing, all those elements of community? Those are the tactics that determine whether schools can safely reopen or not the distance between desks or the shielding you have. And this is, again, my opinion. Other people will have different opinions, but I kind of use it like a forest fire analogy, a picnic and a forest fire, right? If there's a forest fire going on and you want to have a picnic in the middle of it, if you have infinite resources and engineers and smart people, you can probably design a way to have a safe picnic in the middle of a forest fire once. The trick is doing that multiple times gets really difficult because each time you do it, there's a risk something goes wrong and then the results are catastrophic. There's very little margin of error on the downside. We're allowed a little slipshod of, hey, and we know how schools and universities are with, dealing with all these different aged folks, right? There's very little margin for downside, but there's catastrophic results for failure on the upside. And so the forest fire picnic analogy is, sure, you could potentially engineer a way to have a picnic in a forest fire, but why would you want to? You stop the forest fire, you put the forest fire out, and then you have as many picnics as you want. That's, I think, the paradigm shift here that people need to get around, and the policymakers need to get around. And I understand that with schools, there's been this push to how do we reopen? And it reminds me of the push that happened 2 months ago with the economy. How do we reopen the businesses? How do we make businesses safe so we can do it? I think, though, we're going to see the same effect. If we continue to push by, this push to reopen schools, because we think we can, we're going to be in the same situation we're now seeing businesses in. We pushed businesses to reopen. They reopened, cases surged, and now the businesses are closing again. So if we reopen schools, and I know some of them are going to be opening here in the next month to month and a half because of timing, and decisions are being made now, and it's like, we can't wait, we have to decide now. My prediction is any school that opens is probably going to face a serious risk of having to close again before they have completed the first semester of the school in which they reopened for. And that may be different in some states, like if Alaska gets its case control, or Hawaii, these isolated states. But when you have 60,000 cases in the continental US every single day, there's a ping pong effect. At a macro level, the North and Northwest and West had the initial outbreaks, and the South, Southeast, and Midwest didn't, and they got lax. And then the infections from those areas spread and provided the reservoir that then caused the infection outbreak we're seeing now. And just as the Northeast and the Northwest now are there, it looks calm, it looks better, things are reclined. You cannot get lax because now you have a reservoir in the Midwest, South, and Southeast, and you may have the same effect in reverse. I call it ping pong. We may be ping ponging the infections now in the southern part of the country right back into the Northeast and the Northwest, by late summer, fall, simply because if people are lax, just as if they were lax in the South, they said, hey, no biggie, we're past this, whatever. If you're lax in the North and the Northeast, you're going to have the same effect. And to schools, you're going to see them open only to have to close again if that happens. And I feel bad for saying this, because I'm not saying there's an easy answer. I'm not saying there's not consequences for keeping schools closed. But I think as the earlier schools that open, they're going to have cases the media is going to report on. They're going to have children in hospitals. They're going to have staff in hospitals. They're going to have parents pulling kids out anyway. Homeschooling is going to become really popular really fast. And the entire premise of why we are doing this begins to fall apart. And so my advice is, the pathway to safe reopening schools is the same pathway for the safe reopening of business. It's the same pathway because it's the pandemic response. You have to get the pandemic under control. And until you do, you cannot engineer a safe way to have a picnic in a forest fire. And that's, I'll go through and answer some questions, but that's my take. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.